Sam Beighton is an associate in the competition law team, and we have some changes to the law in relation to a new enterprise and regulatory reform bill, which is changing the way we look at cartels and mergers, and introducing a new way of looking at market shares, and a new way and tactics of how to deal with competition investigation. We will also be looking at some recent developments in relation to the courts. Competition law in the news again. Can you talk me through the new developments in relation to cartels?
Well, there are two key developments being proposed under the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act. The first is in relation to the cartel offence in itself. The second is in relation to the possibility of higher financial penalties being imposed. Now, just with regard to the cartel offence, as it currently is drafted, the cartel offence imposes a criminal offence whereby if an individual dishonestly enters into arrangements with an individual at a competing firm, they are committing a criminal offence which, conviction upon indictment, they face a maximum of up to 5 years in prison and or an unlimited fine. Now, the offences falling within the cartel offence activities are, for example, bid rigging, market sharing and price fixing. But a key aspect of the offence is the dishonesty requirement. Now, the OFT has stated it's been very difficult to bring prosecutions under the cartel offence. The cartel offence has been on the books since 2003, but to date there's only been one case which has led to convictions. Now, the government would like there to be more convictions, so the proposed reform is around removing the dishonesty requirement. Now, this could clearly have quite far-reaching and potentially unintended consequences, and it does remain to be seen whether or not this will actually make prosecutions easier. The second development is in relation to the possibility of higher financial penalties being imposed. This follows on from the government stating that it wishes to have financial penalties which reflect the seriousness of the infringement and also have a deterrent effect. And again, this is a wait and see really in terms of how this will play out in practice.
Are there specific areas at higher risk of investigation than others, and if so, what are they and why?
In truth, Michael, no. I think all areas currently are at risk of investigation by the OFT. It's made very clear that it seeks to have a balanced portfolio of cartel cases, and it will therefore not just be seeking to go after big household names in big markets. Its recent decisional practice reflects that it has sought to take action against small players in small markets, and this will also extend to its criminal enforcement activities. So therefore, if you're a company active in the UK, you need to be playing by the competition rules, and if you're not, both your company and your employees risk investigation by the OFT. I think this really emphasises the importance of having a robust compliance programme in place.
There are changes in relation to mergers as well. What's going on here?
There are a number of key changes being proposed under the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Bill in terms of mergers. The first is an organisational change, which will see the merger of the Office of Fair Trading, the Phase 1 body in the UK for merger investigation, with the Competition Commission, which is the Phase 2 body. By merging these two together, the Competition and Markets Authority, or the CMA, will be formed. Now, in this context, the CMA is proposed will receive new powers, stronger powers in relation to merger control, and there will be a streamlining of the merger control process. In relation to the stronger powers, one aspect of this is increased powers with regard to hold separate provisions. And in terms of streamlining the merger control process, there is to be a new 40 working day statutory timetable imposed in relation to Phase 1 merger investigations. Now, taken as a whole, it may well be that these changes mean that the UK merger regime, although technically remaining voluntary, becomes a little less voluntary than it was before, as it may well be that parties seek the certainty that comes from notifying and obtaining clearance before they actually complete their deals going forwards.
Are there any key points of which in-house lawyers ought to be aware when contemplating a merger?
I think the first key point is not to underestimate the level of preparation that's required, because an in-house lawyer is going to want to think about the likelihood, firstly, the deal will actually be cleared, when the deal is likely to be cleared, and whether any undertakings may need to be offered, for example, divestments, so as to enable that clearance to be obtained. Now, I think in that context, there are three key points that I would flag for in-house lawyers to consider. The first would be in relation to market definition. Now, this isn't the be-all and end-all of merger assessment, but it is important, and the authority will always look to have the narrowest possible definition of a market. Now this can give rise to quite unexpected results. Secondly, in relation to competitive dynamics, it's important for in-house counsel to be able to show how the market really works, who competes with who, and how the merger will impact upon those dynamics. And then I think finally, evidencing those competitive dynamics, how can you best present your arguments as to why this merger will not result in a lessening of competition? What data do you have available? Is it sufficient? If it's not sufficient, what else can you put together? So I think in summary, it's really be prepared and consider the deal from as many angles as possible.
A hold separate sounds like the kind of thing I need when my children are arguing, but what are they and what impact do they have?
Hold separate undertakings or initial undertakings are undertakings that the OFT may seek from a buyer party in respect of a completed transaction. And the purpose of a hold separate undertaking is really just that, to hold separate. So the acquired business is not integrated within the buyer's business. The purpose of this is that if at the end of the investigation it is decided that the purchase business must be divested, this can be achieved with relative ease. The unfortunate consequence of a hold separate undertaking is that once it's been given by the buyer, they really are in a position where they can do very little with the business that they have just purchased without the written consent of the OFT. There are changes being proposed in relation to hold separates which will really strengthen their use from current. One of those big changes is that there will be no seeking in future of hold separate undertakings. They may just be imposed by the authority, and they can be imposed prior to completion of a deal. So anticipated acquisition, these can be put in place. They also will be backed up by financial penalties, so that if you breach a hold separate imposition in this way, the parties can be fined up to 5% of the group worldwide turnover of the parties concerned. So this is becoming an increasingly big deal in the context of UK merger control.
We all believe that competition law is all down to market shares, but I've heard that that's changing. What's happening here?
Well, in the merger context, it's now been acknowledged that market shares don't really tell the full picture. So, for example, if you are a big player and you buy a small player, on market shares alone, there's little difference perhaps. But if that small player is a maverick player who's been driving price competition or investing in innovation, by purchasing that player, you may well have lessened competition in a way that market shares cannot pick up. So the OFT is now increasingly using economic tools in its phase one investigations. For example, recent cases, it's been looking at trying to model economic incentives to raise prices. It's been doing this by looking at variable profit margins and consumer survey evidence of switching. So in this context, parties need to go beyond just relying upon market share arguments. They need to be thinking about economic evidence they may require to really put their story forward as to why the merger they're involved in will not give rise to a lessening of competition.
What kind of claims are we seeing in the courts in relation to competition?
Well, in relation to claims before the courts, what we're seeing at the moment is a large volume of so-called follow-on actions. And these are actions which follow on from an infringement decision which has been found by a competition authority such as the European Commission. Now before the High Court we're seeing an approach which tends to be quite favourable to claimants. So the High Court takes quite a broad approach to jurisdiction as well as to pleadings, which is making the High Court a very popular venue for bringing follow-on actions at this point in time. In addition to follow-on actions, there's a growing number of standalone actions being brought, which is where the parties, without having the benefit of an infringement decision, themselves seek to evidence an infringement of competition law has occurred. They may do this to try and drive a commercial settlement or to upset a negotiation dynamic. In this context, I think that where we have this growing awareness of competition, litigation and interest in the same, we're likely to see the current trend upwards in relation to litigation before the courts.
You've mentioned the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Bill. Can you summarise the key points of that bill for us?
Key highlights in terms of that bill would be firstly in relation to the cartel offence, the proposed removal of the dishonesty requirement, where will this lead to? Secondly, in relation to mergers, we see the creation of the Competition and Markets Authority, much stronger powers, attempts to streamline the merger process in the UK. Will this shift it from a voluntary process to more of a mandatory process going forwards?
Thank you, Sam. There's certainly a lot to get our head round.
Thanks, Michael.